So, Kenny, the co-main event was to be Khabib Nurmagomedov against Tony Ferguson. And I said on Twitter, I feel like this is the best fight in any division that we can put on paper right now. You remember how excited we were when Conor McGregor and Rafael dos Anjos were matched up? Two truly elite mixed martial artists in their prime. We were so excited about that fight, we could barely even analyze it effectively. And I feel like for Nurmagomedov and Ferguson, at least on paper, for hardcore fans, I feel like that is as good a matchup that we can put on paper in any division. We've tried to make the fight in 2015, 2016, and now 2017. Nurmagomedov unable to make the walk this weekend due to weight management issues. Goes to the hospital when he was 5.5 or 6 pounds away from the number. Whether it was pain in his liver or his kidney, I don't know. But big picture here, Kenny, some have criticized the promotion maybe for coming out and saying, hey, if he just calls Dr. Davidson and lets us try to get him to a good place, maybe this fight still happens. I'm just going to give you my opinion and then get your more expert thoughts on this as a guy who has stared death in the face and cut down to 145 pounds on 2 different occasions. So if you're Nurmagomedov, right, and you really want to make this walk at all costs, I think your manager Ali wakes up and he calls Dr. Davidson. I think that's the first thing he does. If your number one priority is getting Khabib back to health and you're not thinking about the fight, then I think you go to Sunrise Hospital and you get fluids. And ultimately that was what they chose to do.
Yeah, it was very unfortunate. My understanding is that the issue, it was an issue of blood pressure. That's what I heard is that apparently his blood pressure was quite low. So, they made the call to go to the hospital. And, yeah, unfortunately, listen, the doctor for the UFC is phenomenal. And he's a guy that he does this all the time. He's a guy who is called in if there's any kind of emergency. And the fact that he wasn't called is a shame because the fight could have been saved. The fight really could have been saved. And, I know Dana White said they went rogue and all that stuff. I think they were probably trying to keep it under wraps and, make sure Khabib was able to fight. And so they tried not to get the UFC involved, I guess. But it's unfortunate all the way around. And, I know Brian Stan might disagree with me a little bit, but, they tried to make this fight happen 3 times. I would still like to see this fight happen. I think it's a fight that still needs to happen. And as far as those two, if they want a shot at the belt, if they want Conor to accept them, really, as his next opponent, they need to fight each other. There needs to be some hype around these guys. And they needed each other to get that fight against Conor. Because I'm telling you right now, the UFC isn't calling the shots here. Conor's the one who's calling the shots with this belt. So he decides who he wants to fight, the same way that essentially George St. Pierre picked Michael Bisping for who he wanted to fight. Conor's at that level. George St. Pierre is at that level. When you're demanding, when you can demand that kind of pay-per-view buy, you do what you want. Let's be honest. And I think that if those guys want to have that big-time payday or that big-time fight against Conor McGregor, they need each other to fight to say, okay, we found him. We found the best 155-pounder in the world, guys. It's Tony Ferguson or it's Khabib Nurmagomedov. Let's get it on here with Conor.
Yeah, and I'd like to see that land, as I know Daniel Cormier would financially, at UFC 210. It's about 5 weeks away. There is still an open slot on the pay-per-view, so they could be the co-main event. And you're right, that would obviously, I think, give Tony Ferguson exactly what he needs to command that fight with Conor McGregor. I think he sort of needs that win over Khabib Nurmagomedov to really make people want to see that fight. I mean, obviously, I think Tony Ferguson's as watchable as any fighter on the roster, but I would like to see them make that fight. But as far as Dr. Davidson is concerned, right, he's an ER doctor. He's on call. He works at like 7 different hospitals in the area, and Nurmagomedov ended up at a hospital that Dr. D doesn't control. Ali has Dr. D's number. Again, they chose to go this route and get to the hospital, and I'm always in favor of erring on the side of fighter safety. But I do believe that when you go to the hospital, immediately what they're going to do is try to get you back to health and pump you with fluids. And I would imagine that within a half an hour of him getting to that hospital, his camp was probably resigned to the fact that the fight wasn't going to happen. So instead of going to Dr. D and potentially having them check the vitals before they go, all hands on deck with fluids and everything else, it played out the way it played out. Hopefully Khabib gets healthy. Feel badly for Tony, who at least gets his show money. Disappointed that fight didn't play out. But, these lightweights, Kenny, that they thrusted into this co-main event slot, David Tamer and Lando Venata, it sounded like promotional hyperbole to some when I said that they were worthy of this showcase. But proof's in the pudding. They showed you exactly why they were the guys who got the co-main event opportunity. And how about David fucking Tamer, man?
It was a really fun fight, man. And, I completely wrote off Mr. Tamer because, I was saying there's no way Venata's going to get him out of there. I think Tamer has a lot of promise, a lot of potential. But, striking-wise, I feel like, he just didn't have the experience as far as mixed martial arts. And this guy's fought a lot in Muay Thai and kickboxing. Very effective there. I thought Venata was going to be able to take him down. I thought his movement was going to be a problem against the Muay Thai striker. And it was in the first round. And it's crazy to me that they scored it 30-27 across the board for Tamer. I thought Venata certainly won that first round. But I think Venata defensively started getting a little careless in the second and third round. And Tamer started hitting takedowns on him. And whether Venata was getting back to his feet or not, it just looked very bad for Venata. Venata was countering him very well. What was most impressive about Tamer was his toughness, and he didn't get rattled when he was getting countered on some of those kicks with that right hand of Venata. He kept throwing it. He went right back at Venata and said, that doesn't bother me. I'm going to throw it right back at you again. And that seemed to really throw Venata off a little bit. I think Venata thought that his composure and his movement was going to throw Tamer off, and it did for a little bit, but not enough where Tamer backed down at all. Very impressed with those two. They put on a phenomenal fight. Little setback here for Venata. I think he needs to get better defensively. He needs to get better with his wrestling as well. But what a great fight, man.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes an amazing chin can work against you because you are so able to take these power shots, but if you don't end up finishing the other guy, then you lose on the scorecards. You can be sure Brandon Gibson will go back to the film room and make the requisite adjustments. I still think Lando Venata is a guy that's going to eventually work his way into the top 10, but that's where I think David Tamer is headed, and he's certainly going to get a ranked opponent. I was just blown away by his performance, and I think technically you set up a lot of the things that he did well. I think he's certainly a guy that benefited from the experience on the Ultimate Fighter. Here's a guy who lost his pro debut, has since won 6 in a row. He won a couple of fights on the Ultimate Fighter representing Team McGregor, and now a win like this I think is really going to propel him forward. If you're looking for guys to take the torch from Alexander Gustafsson in Sweden, this is the guy right now, David Tamer, with a big win over the weekend. All right, Daniel fucking Kelly. Dan fucking Kelly is 6-1 in the Ultimate Fighting Championship with a win now over the former UFC light heavyweight champion Rashad Evans. This guy's an even better fighter than anyone's still giving him credit for, Kenny. I mean, we knew about the striking defense going in, right? His footwork, despite being a plodding guy who will be 40 on Halloween, his striking defense has always been some of the best in this division. He knows how to get that big old melon off the center line, very good footwork to set up his offense. And even though it doesn't look otherworldly or slick necessarily, this guy is super effective, man. Perfect game plan, near perfect execution. And this guy just continues to defy the odds and overachieve. Truly one of the true feel-good stories over the last several years. When you think about this guy fighting Patrick Walsh in Broomfield, Colorado, what is arguably the worst fight in UFC history, and what he's been able to accomplish since with 4 consecutive wins. Absolutely unbelievable. I feel really good for Daniel Kelly here Monday morning.
Oh, and he did it on one leg, by the way. I mean, his knee was completely destroyed. We heard from him that his knee was in really bad shape, had a couple tears in there, and still was quite effective. His movement was very impressive. He has really improved as a striker, man. And and he did it against Rashad, who finally kind of let his hands go. I don't think he kicked enough. To me, that was the most bothersome thing about Rashad is he didn't throw enough kicks. And every time he went upstairs, I tell you what, man, he was very close to getting that head clean on Daniel Kelly. But the other thing I thought he should have done a little bit more was, kicking that bad knee. I mean, someone's got a knee brace on there. Why don't you kick the inside of that leg? I thought Rashad did a good job of getting it on the legs of Daniel Kelly, Ben, but those judo hips, he popped right back to his feet. He's one of those guys who's so difficult to take down. I thought his southpaw stance really threw Rashad off, and it was a great win for Daniel Kelly. Very, very impressed with that guy, especially at his age and all the injuries he's dealt with. It was his biggest fight of his career and his best performance.
So Rashad Evans had some moments in the fight, as you alluded to, but here's a guy who just hasn't competed all that often dating to 2013. He had a 2-year layoff and then eventually was able to come back for a couple fights. Ryan Bader, Glover Teixeira. and then had another 1 year layoff in advance of this one. So here's Rashad Evans, 37, 38 years old, certainly said all the right things. When we talked to him, I mean, he seemed to be very articulate, of a very healthy mindset, cut the weight and managed the weight cut beautifully. I don't know how he felt his body held up. You know, obviously, as you always say, fighting at the weight is different than making the weight, but I know this is hard for you to answer, and obviously we both are pretty close with Rashad. We've worked with him now for almost 10 years. What would you like to see Rashad Evans do? Would you like to see him compete again here at 185 pounds?
You know, I said this on the post-fight show, and you know, as you always say, it's very difficult to retire someone. But I feel, this is just my opinion, if you're not putting out your best work as a fighter, as an artist, whatever it is, I don't know if you should still compete. That's just my opinion, because, number one, I think you should always be putting out your best stuff as much as you can as an athlete. As soon as that starts to die down, you know, I just think it's time to hang it up. And number two, you know, we're not hitting balls out there. We're not playing baseball. We're not, you know, shooting baskets. We're getting hit in the head, and it's a very different thing. And I would hate to see Rashad take more damage. He didn't get hurt here in this fight against Daniel Kelly, thankfully. But you know, the fights against Glover Teixeira, you know, that's tough to watch, man. It's very tough to watch, and I just would hate to see him take any more damage moving forward. And I just feel like, you know, this isn't an issue that's been going on for one fight, two fights, three fights. This has been an issue with Rashad now for several fights, unfortunately. And yeah, he's been fighting a very long time, and hopefully he has enough money in order to do that. If he doesn't, then I guess that's a different. It's probably a different answer on his part. But you know, that's my opinion on that, and really, it's all about